the introduction, and thank you everyone for coming. It's nice to see so many people here, I think. Thanks again to IWP for hosting, as well as Dr. Kodakevich for encouraging me to do a presentation on this, which actually a paper that I wrote for his class last semester. So we'll start out. World War II was known in Russia and many of the former Soviet republics as the Great Patriotic War. This is perhaps the most cataclysmic event in the history of the Soviet Union, aside from its creation and dissolution. Estimates of Soviet soldiers killed in the war range from about 7 million to 14 million. Anvar Smilov, after a comprehensive study of more recent available sources, estimates the total to be 13,850,000. And this number does not include Soviet civilian casualties, which were comparable or even greater in scale, though certainty on this topic is nearly impossible. Regardless of the exact losses, the impact on Soviet society was both physically and psychologically devastating. The Great Patriotic War has thus become emblematic of the power of collective memory and its political distortion to shape perceptions of current events in the post-Soviet sphere. It's therefore ripe for exploitation by the Kremlin. The treatment of the Great Patriotic War in Russia particularly closely resembles Eric Hobsbawm's theory of invented tradition, which Miguel Vázquez-Liñán invokes to describe, quote, the construction of an ad hoc historical discourse that serves the interests of the present. Invented tradition serves to legitimize a government and its policies, frequently taking on a ritualistic character, in order to, and I have a quote from him there, construct a certain order amid the chaos of daily life, establishing certain aspects of coexistence, and forcing the periodic repetition of a recreated, fictitious past to ultimately compose a certain social imaginary. Although these invented traditions may not have a large impact on citizens' private lives, we cannot say the same of the public sphere in which they play, or pretend to play, an important role in social cohesion. Obviously, the Second World War was not a fictitious event, nor was the immense sacrifice and eventual victory of the Soviet Union and its allies. But the glorification of the Soviet Union's role in the war must necessarily involve either a reconciliation with the communist past and the atrocities committed, or a refusal to acknowledge that the conflict was not a simplistic battle between good and evil. In the Putin era, the latter circumstances reigned, revealing itself through a deliberate shaping of history, a rehabilitation of the Soviet Union, including Stalin, and the rituals of invented tradition, namely Victory Day celebrations, and the associated rhetoric which harkens back to the days of the war and colors Russian discourse even in seemingly unrelated contexts. Soviet history, and indeed reality, has been manipulated by the state and used to fulfill ideological needs long before the Putin era. Stalin and his Commissar of Foreign Affairs, Vyacheslav Molotov, made official pronouncements on the origins of the war and the Soviet Union's participation in it, which were distilled into Falsifiers of History, a pamphlet which suggested that the Soviet Union was at all times a peace-loving state, but was forced to confront and destroy the fascist threat by Hitler and his evil ideology. Teddy J. Aldrich argues that the National Patriotic School of Russian historiography, which has blossomed under Putin, has taken a similar approach, though of course without assuming the infallibility of the Communist Party. Rather, these historians, quote, seek to establish a heroic and usable past, out of which a resurgent, proud, nationalist Russia might be reborn. Examples of such interpretations in the case of the beginning of the war would be acknowledging the secret protocols of the Nazi-Soviet pact existed, but spinning them as rightfully restoring Russian territory lost during the First World War, or as an attempt at the liberation of Poland, both of which are predicated on the assumption that Stalin's diplomatic skill and strong leadership was pivotal and beneficial to the country. Russian officials at the highest levels have openly espoused a version of history which glorifies the Russian role and minimizes negative elements. On June 22, 2016, on the anniversary of the start of the Great Patriotic War, in an address to delegates to the Russian National Historical Assembly, Vladimir Putin emphasized the importance of the victory over the Nazis for the survival of the Russian people. This is a quotation from him. You've just spoken about the need to know what the Nazis perpetrated in our land. My German friend read different historical documents about what Hitler had planned to do with the Russian people had he won, where the Russian people would have ended up, far away in Siberia, essentially doomed to extinction. Everyone should know this, including those who are trying to reinterpret what happened and draw conclusions, which no one has the right to do today, or to denounce somebody. It is necessary to look at what would have happened to us if we had been defeated. It's not difficult to understand the subtext here. Essentially, because the threat to the Soviet Union was an existential one, it is not acceptable to pry too deeply into the means. What matters is the end, which would be the victory. Similarly, in an interview with Russia Today in preparation for the 70th anniversary of Victory Day, Chief of Staff of the Presidential Executive Office, Sergei Ivanov, warned against changing history, placing particular blame on the West. And this is a quotation from him. I'm also concerned that politicians in some countries, particularly in Western Europe, in the United States, purposely try to rewrite history, to twist history, to put, for example, communism and Nazism on one level. Western countries want to use this not very moral method to isolate Russia. I think it's propaganda. We are often accused of propaganda, I know, by the Western media, but in this case, it's obviously Western propaganda. Unfortunately, the Nazis and Soviets had much more in common than Ivanov suggests, a toxic ideology combined with a penchant for brutality toward their own people. It becomes clear that rewriting history, in this case, simply means calling attention to events which portray the historic Russia as fallible, to put it mildly. Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev pursued the same theme a few years prior, excluding the Great Patriotic War from any scrutiny. History, the October Revolution, he says, for instance, can be assessed in various ways. But the Great Patriotic War was the nation's defense from the aggressor. No discussions must arise over obvious facts, at least in textbooks. Let scholars write whatever they like. But the authors of textbooks and the general accessible media must stick to the generally accepted point of view on such events. It comes as no surprise, then, that the importance of a strong state is continually emphasized in Russian history textbooks. According to David Satter, this came about in the mid-2000s. He notes that Igor Zalutsky's textbook, A History of the Homeland in the 20th Century, was a balanced view of the Soviet era and acknowledged its offenses, including the occupation of the Baltics, the shooting of citizens within the Soviet Union for cowardice, and the 1939 division of Eastern Europe between Hitler and Stalin. But this popular textbook fell out of favor with the Ministry of Education. A few years later, teachers were using a widely published manual by Alexander Filipov, a Russian political operative, which portrayed the Soviet past in a more positive light. It gave rise to state-supported history textbooks, which, according to Satter, justified the regime's worst crimes, including collectivization and the Great Terror, and included numerous dubious historical claims about the nature of Soviet Union's conduct in World War II. In this way, suggests Mikhail Vasquez-Lignan, the Russian government emphasizes the importance of the victory over less savory elements of history. To do so, as we've seen, requires either a falsification of the historical record or an attempt to justify crimes, in effect, a rehabilitation of the Soviet past. Part of this rehabilitation comes in the form of the rituals of invented tradition, which Lignan references, namely the yearly patriotic celebrations of Victory Day, and the lingering veneration of Stalin as the leader of this victory. Satter tells the story of Oral Russia, whose city council in March 2005 voted to rehabilitate Stalin by restoring his name to landmarks and erecting a bust of him in the city center, despite the fact that tens of thousands of people in the city were arrested, and a sizable portion shot during the Stalin era. There was a mixture of outrage and support for the motion, but the editor of the local newspaper in the city neatly summarized the situation for Satter, saying, "All that is left of the former superpower is the victory in the Second World War. In the mass consciousness, the symbol of that victory is Stalin. Until 1993, the immunity to Stalin was very strong, but now I think we will resurrect Stalin. There's a strong demand for a firm hand. This comes from the chaos and disorder in the country." The plan for the Stalin Renaissance was never fulfilled in Orel. Other considerations took precedence. Yet this is just one example of the elevation of the victory in the Second World War and Stalin's leading role in it to an almost untouchable status. To this day, Stalin's grave remains in a position of honor outside the walls of the Kremlin, strewn with bouquets of flowers. And this is a recent poll from the Levada Center in which 1,600 Russians were surveyed and asked to give the names of the 10 most outstanding figures of all time. And this year, in 2017, this was only about a month or two ago that the survey actually took place, 38% mentioned Stalin. And you can see that in first there, you can see the progression of how many people mentioned Stalin over the years. The second place person is Putin, third is Pushkin, fourth is Lenin, and fifth is Peter the First, or Peter the Great. So it's also interesting to note that they're all the top 10 this year were all Russians, even though people could choose from anyone in the world. The Great Patriotic War and the celebrations and pronouncements associated with its various anniversaries serve as an opportunity for the government to put on a fantastic show of pomp and patriotism. On May 9th, 2015, the 70th anniversary of Victory Day, a particularly lavish military parade was staged in Red Square. Soviet symbols, regalia, and military might, including bombers and tanks, both new and historic, and 15,000 troops were on full display. Though Victory Day celebrations in Moscow are always grand spectacles, the 70th anniversary marked a new level of expense and effort. The budget was 28.5 billion rubles, with 12.5 billion going toward veterans housing and 12.3 billion for veterans social services, according to Sergei Ivanov, chairman of the organizing committee. He said, "Despite not a very bright economic situation in Russia, we deliberately decided not to make any cuts for the preparations. Of course, it's not possible to track how the money was spent. Parades and celebrations in 150 cities, including outside of Russia in former Soviet republics, were planned, as well as 5 naval parades and 5 air shows. Russia is so serious about the Great Patriotic War that it even has a military theme park. I use the term theme park loosely because it's not like a place that has roller coasters or anything, but you'll see what I mean. A project of the Russian Ministry of Defense, Patriot Park in Kubinka, Moscow Oblast, officially opened to the public in 2016 and features vast swaths of military vehicles and hardware, historical exhibits, and interactive experiences. A World War II-era partisan village has been recreated for visitors, complete with the opportunity to enjoy some delicious army porridge or bread. That's from the website. The park also includes a dedicated space, which is still in progress, for the Ministry of Defense-sponsored youth organization, UNARMIA, which is described as a military patriotic movement in which members participate in military tactical games, Great Patriotic War reenactments, and community service. Recently, in preparation for the 2017 Victory Day commemoration, a 1,500-person UNARMIA reenactment of the Battle of Berlin was performed, complete with a replica of the Reichstag over which the Soviet flag was raised. And the Minister of Defense Sergei Shoigu was present for this event as well. Patriot Park also includes its own chapel, which recalls the active involvement of the Russian Orthodox Church in the Great Patriotic War and the intimate relationship between church and state in Putin's Russia. Roger Rees notes that the Russian Orthodox Church was involved in the war effort for longer than originally believed. That is, until Stalin rehabilitated the church for patriotic purposes in September 1943. Shortly after the German invasion in June 1941, Metropolitan Sergei distributed a pastoral letter which threw the support of the church behind the war effort. This is an excerpt from that letter. "This is not the first time that the Russian people have endured suffering, and on this occasion, with God's help, they will grind the hostile forces of fascism into dust. Our native land is being defended by the force of arms, by the common heroism of its people, and by a general willingness to serve our country in this difficult trial. The Church of Christ confers its blessing on all Orthodox believers in their defense of the holy borders of our motherland." The church also collected donations and used some of its own remaining funds to finance 2 aircraft squadrons and an entire column of 40 tanks. These new details about the early involvement of the Russian Orthodox Church have only recently been revealed, and serve to promote the church's claim that it was motivated by patriotism, a point that it uses to claim legitimacy in contemporary Russia. The church at Patriot Park, built in honor of St. George, was consecrated by Metropolitan Tribunal on May 23, 2016. The website of Patriot Park states that the chapel, quote, was built for the glory of the Russian army and in memory of the fallen in defense of the fatherland, end quote, and services are held there on a regular basis. The patriotic fervor of victory lives on in Russia not only in the physical trappings of parades and commemorations, but also in the rhetoric surrounding the war. To compare Putin and Stalin as people or leaders ventures into questionable territory, and I'm not going to go there, but it's significant to note that Putin's Victory Day speeches are strikingly similar to Stalin's wartime encouragements to the Soviet people. The differences between them, however, are evidence of the use of historical rhetoric to further contemporary ends. In an examination of Putin's Victory Day speech of 2015 and 2016, and Stalin's wartime speeches on occasions such as the anniversary of the October Revolution or the anniversary of the founding of the Red Army, both men emphasize the role of the Soviet Union or Russia, respectively, as the defender of civilization itself and as a force for freedom and liberation. Both Stalin and Putin frame the conversation about the war in terms of civilization, of which the Soviet Union and Russia are the defenders, and barbarity. In his wartime speeches, Stalin repeatedly mentions that the German army is one of, quote, medieval obscurantism, end quote, and that the fascists are enemies of European culture. The goal of the Allied forces is thus to save mankind from reversion to savagery and medieval brutality. Putin continues this narrative, stating that, quote, it was our soldiers who paid back the Nazis and the Allies in full for the millions of victims, for all the barbarities and atrocities on our land. Today, civilization is again facing cruelty and violence. Terrorism has become a global threat, end quote. Quite obviously, as it does not fit the narrative, Putin does not apologize for or even mention the atrocities which the Soviet Union committed against its own people during the war. But the allusion to terrorism as the new existential threat to civilization is an effort to galvanize the Russian population in support of the state against this new barbarism, in effect preparing for another battle for the future of the entire humanity, as Putin characterizes the Great Patriotic War. Relatedly, both Putin and Stalin focus on the role of the Soviet Union as a liberating force, a constant theme which is disputed by those living in territories reoccupied by the Soviets, who changed hands from one totalitarian system to another. Quote, it was the Soviet people who brought freedom to other peoples, end quote, Putin asserted in his 2016 Victory Day speech. A year before, his argument was the same, presented without necessary caveats. Quote, our people liberated European nations from the Nazis, end quote. Stalin peddles this narrative incessantly in his wartime speeches as well. Quote, the Red Army man can proudly say that he is waging a just war, a war for liberation, Stalin declares. He goes further into the realm of absurdity when discussing the Soviet Union and its allies' mission to, quote, grant the liberated peoples of Europe the full right and freedom to decide for themselves the question of their own form of government, end quote. The cases of Poland and Czechoslovakia, for example, show the emptiness of this promise, even though Stalin counts the Soviet Union among the freedom-loving nations. That there's no real shift from the Soviet line to Putin's rhetoric can only be attributed to willful deception in pursuit of political goals. More broadly, both Putin and Stalin make use of high-flown, nationalistic, patriotic, and occasionally bombastic language. A comparison of general statements about the victory is illustrative of the similarity in the style. First, a representative segment of Putin's 2015 Victory Day speech, which you can see on the right. Our fathers and grandfathers lived through unbearable sufferings, hardships, and losses. They worked till exhaustion, at the limit of human capacity. They fought even unto death. They proved the example of honor and true patriotism. We pay tribute to all those who fought to the bitter for every street, every house, and every frontier of our motherland. Long live the victorious people. Note that Putin's rhetorical style does not differ substantially from Stalin's, which you can see on the left. The great sacrifices that we have made in the name of liberty and independence of our motherland, the innumerable exertions and sufferings that our people had to bear in the course of the war, the strenuous work in the rear and the front that they have brought to the fatherland have not been in vain. They have been crowned by complete victory over the enemy. Eternal glory to the heroes who fell in battle against the enemy and gave their lives for the freedom and happiness of our motherland. Other than the differences relating to verb tense and time, obviously, side by side the language of these two passages is nearly indistinguishable. Again, this is not to suggest that Putin and Stalin are the same, but it's clear that Stalin's original wartime rhetoric has found its way into contemporary discourse, even at the very top. However, there's one very significant difference in the way Putin and Stalin address the contributions of the other Allied forces to the war effort. Both are operating with political purposes in mind, naturally, which differ according to the needs of the time. Thus, Stalin places significantly more emphasis on the importance of the Allies, particularly early on in the war, and for good reason. Their military and monetary aid will turn out to be essential to sustaining the Soviet forces. Later in the war, he credits the United States and Great Britain for their considerable contribution to these Red Army's successes. Perhaps most interestingly, given Dmitry Medvedev's excoriation of biased interpretations, namely the fact that, quote, it was not we who defeated the enemy, and that the Americans did, and the Second Front helped, end quote, Stalin himself lauds the opening of the Second Front as vital to achieving victory. Stalin says, the troops and navy of our allies accomplished a mass landing operation on the coast of France that has no parallel in history for scope and organization, and overcame the German fortifications with consummate skill. Thus, Germany found herself gripped in a vice between two fronts. There can be no doubt that without the opening of a second front in Europe, our troops would not have been able to break the resistance of the German forces and knock them out of the Soviet Union in such a short time, end quote. He goes on to commend the Red Army for its powerful offensive operations, which greatly aided their allies. But Stalin is actually rather fair in his portrayal of the contributions of other Allied forces to Soviet efforts in the East. This theme of camaraderie and repeated insistence on the joint nature of the fight against Nazi Germany runs throughout Stalin's wartime speeches, when good relations with the Allies were a necessity, and was treated more dismissively by Putin in his Victory Day speeches of late, when relations with the West are particularly tense. Putin's 2016 Victory Day speech contains no explicit or implicit references to any of the other Allied forces playing part in the victory. His speech on the 70th anniversary of the victory is more fleshed out, but his references to the Western Allies seem to be an excuse to malign their current bad behavior as he sees it. Putin begins with an ode to the assistance of the Allied nations and the anti-fascists of various countries, and a reference to the meeting on the Elbe River as an example of, quote, the trust and unity that became our common legacy, and an example of unification of peoples for the sake of peace and stability, values that became the foundation of the post-World War order, end quote. Yet immediately after this obliging recognition, Putin takes a sharp turn, saying that recently these, quote, basic principles of international cooperation have come to be increasingly ignored, end quote. He makes it clear that he is singling out the United States when he calls out attempts to establish a unipolar world, and implicates the rest of the West with its strong-arm bloc thinking gaining momentum. He then offers a prescription for this problem, mainly, quote, a system of equal security for all states, which should rest on a regional and global non-bloc basis, end quote. Moralizing complete, Putin continues into the final half of the speech, with no further mention of the West. The Western contribution to the Allied victory has been pushed aside in Russia as relations have worsened. The symbolism of the Great Patriotic War has found expression in other anti-Western outlets as well. One notable example is the youth organization, Nashi. Founded in 2005 under the pretense of being an independent organization, though in reality the Kremlin's role in establishing and perpetuating the group was substantial. Nashi was a self-styled youth democratic anti-fascist movement. Though its ideological profile changed slightly according to political expediency, it's no accident that its first rally was held on Victory Day 2005, a few months after Ukraine's Orange Revolution. The group invoked the wartime notion of Russia under attack to support a strong identification with the state against nefarious Western influences. Julie Hemmett writes in 2012, quote, "The enemy or other," Nashi portrays, "is a complex amalgam of undesirable forces. Nashi proclaims its aim is to end the unnatural union of oligarchs, anti-Semites, Nazis, and liberals. It invokes a Western-sponsored liberal-fascist alliance that seeks to interfere with Russia's autonomy and strength." End quote. The Russian Great Patriotic War narrative has not just colored relations between itself and the West. It is spread outward to encompass the way it approaches former Soviet republics, in particular those with Russian and Russian-speaking minorities. Nowhere is this mentality reflected more virulently in the post-Soviet sphere than Russia's relationship with Ukraine. Sergei Ivanov, when asked about the possible danger of a growing neo-Nazi movement in Eastern Europe and some Western European nations, stated, quote, "In Baltic States, in Ukraine, now you can see openly Nazi marches. With torches with Nazi symbols, they are open, and we are very much concerned that local governments do nothing to prevent it." End quote. Ivanov references here the narrative propagated by Russian state media, namely television, which is where most Russians get their news, which associates the Euromaidan movement with radical neo-Nazi fringe groups. The latter exist, certainly, and are to be condemned, but the majority of Ukrainians in support of stronger ties with the West and freedom from the yoke of the Kremlin are not fascist. The Ukrainian crisis as a whole has stoked the fires of anti-EU and anti-American sentiment. Roman Horbach suggests that the incendiary language with which Russian media characterizes the fighting between Russian-backed separatists and Western Ukrainians is one way of, quote, foregrounding the radical Ukrainian elements and foreign actors while backgrounding the indigenous agency, liberal and progressive forces. The locals are pacifized, except the radical groups, and all protesters are then aggregated under the level of extremism, end quote. Of course, talk of fascism presents an opportunity to call to mind the Soviet, that is, Russian, existential battle against Nazism. Horbach references, as a vivid example, a story on Russia's Channel 1 network, in which the insurgents of the so-called National Guard are likened to Nazis who are bent on annihilation of men, women, and children in order to take their land and perhaps acquire some slaves. Thus, it suggested that Ukrainians in the Donbass should be fought with the same vigor as the Nazis were fought in the Great Patriotic War, for they are no less evil. Compounding this characterization was a widely publicized story that Ukrainian soldiers had crucified a child, which gained traction despite being completely fabricated. Another omnipresent symbol in Russian media and culture is St. George's ribbon. Its characteristic pattern of orange and black stripes, it's considered a symbol of the victory over Nazism in the Great Patriotic War. And for a personal note, when I was in Russia, I saw these everywhere, on many cars, on sides of buildings. They're really everywhere. However, in the past 12 years, it's come to symbolize solidarity with the Russian government against supposed Western manipulations in Ukraine and elsewhere. Unsurprisingly, the reanimation of St. George's ribbon began as a patriotic movement by Nashi, which distributed ribbons to the Russian public on Victory Day 2005, and the ribbon has since become a staple of patriotic displays. The ribbon itself is not particularly problematic, but it took on more sinister dimensions after the Russian election protests in 2011. Many of the anti-Putin, anti-corruption protesters there sported white ribbons, and this inspired pro-Kremlin groups to retaliate by wearing the St. George's ribbons and protesting the protesters as unpatriotic and disrespecting the memory of the veterans of the Great Patriotic War. Naturally, Putin himself showed up at a rally in 2011 wearing his own St. George's ribbon. The ribbon has also been used to identify support for the Russian government among Russian minorities and governments loyal to the Kremlin in the post-Soviet spheres. Naturally, Victory Day celebrations in countries which have maintained strong ties to Russia, such as Moldova, Belarus, and Kazakhstan, celebrate in a similar manner. The leaders of these countries generally attend the Victory Day parade in Moscow. The 70th anniversary celebrations featured soldiers from Armenia, Azerbaijan, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan. St. George's ribbon features prominently in Immortal Regiment marches in the post-Soviet sphere. There's a picture of this year's in Washington. In including in the Baltics, and even in Russian expat communities around the globe, including in Canada, the United States, Israel, Spain, and even a small group in China. The marches are a relatively new phenomenon, and according to RT, are, quote, an act of admiration and remembrance of all those who showed bravery during perhaps the most terrifying time in our recent history, end quote. However, it appears that the marches are exclusively focused on commemorating the Soviet military. Soviet and Russian flags are flown, signs are mainly in Russian, old patriotic songs are sung in Russian, children dress up in Soviet regalia, and St. George's ribbons are prominently displayed. In Moldova, for instance, which retains close ties to Russia, an Immortal Regiment March was held last year, which was sponsored by the Party of Communists of the Republic of Moldova and 2 other veteran patriotic groups. The Russian ambassador to Moldova was present, playing a leading role in the rally and reading a statement from President Putin to Moldovan veterans. As the largest republic of the former Soviet Union, and the face and origin of that multinational country, Russian ideology, and thus its representation of the Great Patriotic War, vary in various ways. However, the vastly different experiences of the war by Soviet republics and satellites have prevented Russian Great Patriotic War propaganda from penetrating all of the post-Soviet sphere. We have already discussed Ukraine. It is important to note that since the separatist conflict in eastern Ukraine, there has been a move away from Soviet imagery and Russian representations of the war on the part of the government. On the 70th anniversary of the victory, for instance, poppy flowers have stood in as symbols for the victory itself. Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko's wife, Marina, attended a remembrance poppy ceremony as a step toward promoting a more unifying symbol for the defeat of the Nazis without Soviet apologism. In the case of those nations annexed by the Soviet Union, occupied by the Nazis, and then liberated by the Soviet Union, liberated in quotes, for instance, the Baltic countries, there are much more ambivalent feelings about commemorating the war, which are complicated by the presence of Russian minorities. About 15% of Lithuanians are Russian speakers, and about a third of Latvians and Estonians speak Russian, with slightly more in Latvia. Since the fall of the Soviet Union, Russia has sought to create closer ties with these minorities, which is particularly concerning considering the justification for intervention in Ukraine and the annexation of Crimea. Estonia has a sizable population of Russian speakers in its capital, Tallinn, and the city of Narva, which is overwhelmingly Russian and has a significant number of Russian citizens. Tensions and violence between Estonians and Russians living in Estonia, as well as Russians shipped in from Russia, flared in 2007 when the Estonian government decided to remove a Soviet war memorial. The Russian narrative of the war remains a vital part of the identity of Russian Estonians, and can be exploited by the Russian government to cultivate further loyalty in the Russian population in the former Soviet Union. As in Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania also experienced some tensions with ethnic Russian minorities. Lithuania has a smaller population of Russian speakers than Estonia and Latvia, so is perhaps less susceptible to Russian influence. The more challenging integration of Russian speakers into Lithuanian society has created an opportunity for possible Russian interference on behalf of the rights of the minority. Latvia is a particularly interesting case. 40% of Riga's inhabitants are ethnic Russian, and pro-Russian political parties have made better showings there than in other Baltic states. Because of the significant Russian population, the Great Patriotic War has become a point of tension. Latvian independence saw a return to pre-Soviet traditions, including national holidays. However, Russians living in Latvia were unfamiliar with these holidays and lacked the same framework for understanding them. Put simply, and this can be applied in many cases to Russian minorities who moved to different republics during the time of the Soviet Union, quote, Russians and Latvians in Latvia are split less by ethnic culture, language, and specific characteristics than by ideas about the history of the 20th century, particularly in terms of events in 1939 and 1940, during World War II, and during the Soviet occupation. Latvians see this era as one in which great offenses were committed, while those who arrived in Latvia from other Soviet republics after the war consider it to be a period of Soviet triumphs and achievements. As the Russian Great Patriotic War narrative shows no signs of abating, and as most Russian speakers outside of Russia get their news from Russian language sources, it's important to recognize just how far-reaching the Russian message is and the success it has had with using historical memory for political purposes. The Great Patriotic War remains a powerful symbol in Russia, and for good reason. It significantly impacted the lives of the Soviet people and is a triumphant highlight in an otherwise bleak past. And to note, the purpose of the study is not to discount the real feelings that Russians and members of the former Soviet Union have about the Great Patriotic War, because they're very strong and very real, but rather it's to point out the way the government is able to exploit these emotions for its own purposes. Most concerning of these is a refusal to acknowledge the bitter and conflicted legacy of the Soviet Union's crimes against its own people, and a refusal to condemn Soviet ideology as toxic to humanity. Emotionally charged rhetoric and potent symbolism have become prominent in Victory Day celebrations both in Russia and abroad. This presents challenges to governments abroad with Russian populations who imbibe Kremlin propaganda on the subject, and is an obstacle to establishing historical facts and acknowledging the suffering of non-Russian Soviet people under the yoke of communism. All indicators suggest that the Russian government will continue to spread its view of the past as long as the state deems it necessary to galvanize the support of its people against foreign enemies, be they Ukrainian nationalists or the U.S. State Department. An issue as deeply bound up in the political culture of the region, even more than 70 years later, is unlikely to be publicly questioned by those on the inside who may be seeking to re-examine the war in light of the historical record. And I am going to take questions, apparently. If anyone has questions. Yes. I don't know if we have like a microphone.
I can yell.
Okay.
Two questions. One, you talked about how you saw a chart where Stalin is the most popular Russian leader, right?
That was
Top 10, right?
yeah. The question was who is the most outstanding, basically, person in all of history.
Okay. So I'm used to it because the fact that Stalin is Georgian, like affect how many people actually know in Russia that Stalin is Georgian and he's from but nowadays different country. Was that part of history is kind of forgotten or omitted and said, oh, he was a great Soviet leader and doesn't really matter where he's from, and the fact that Georgia, the country right now, is in really good terms with Russia after the 2008 war, etc., etc. And my second question, really quickly, would be when it comes to the minorities. I've always been curious about the Tatters, how they were deported from now it's Crimea, Ukraine, to by Stalin because of supporting the Nazis, the Germans in World War II. From your research, has that part of history also been forgotten? Just the Russian government just doesn't want to bring it up anymore.
Yes, for the first point of Stalin being Georgian, I think he himself sort of assumed a Russian identity, and that's basically how he was portrayed. And I don't think that it's really a big concern of people that he was actually Georgian. I was reading that he actually made Georgian food more popular in the Moscow area. Now it's actually quite fashionable. As for the Tattars, they're an interesting case because, as opposed to many of the people in Crimea, they consider themselves to be occupied. They obviously never really had a good time of it, and it's interesting. They create kind of a force that I don't think the Russian government wants to acknowledge, or I'm obviously not an expert on the Tattars, but I imagine that their existence and their history presents kind of a problem when trying to sort of explain away some of the not so nice parts of the past. Yes.
Yeah, I just wonder, is this unique? I mean, I don't see any difference in this than any other nation. We have 3 holidays. We have Memorial Day, we have July 4th, we have what's called now Veterans Day, which is Armistice Day. We celebrate in a patriotic fashion, same way. Matter of fact, you talk to a lot of Americans, they don't even know that the Soviet Union was in World War II. they think that the United States won World War II by themselves, you know? So I don't see where this is any much different. I mean, every nation tries to involve its people in patriotic fervor, especially when there are dilemmas like now. I don't see where this is so pertinent any different. I'd like to make some corrections, though. I'm surprised at Stalin talking about the invasion, which was quite nice of him. But I believe Stalingrad was fought in the end of 1942, and the German army was virtually defeated. Then there was a big tank battle afterwards in early 1943, and the German army was almost ruined. And I believe at the end of 1943, maybe someone correct me, I believe Soviet troops were already in Poland, and the invasion of the Allies was June 6, 1944. So I would say the war was virtually over, but the German army was pretty well defeated by then. So the Soviet Union really did win the war in effect, but I never hear, there are no monuments to Soviet people here. I never hear any Americans, you say the Soviets don't give credit. I never hear any Americans give any credit to the Soviet, and in effect, the Soviets saved the Western world. They really saved the Western world. They really defeated the Germans. You know,
Yeah, I'm not trying to make light of the sacrifices that they made. Basically, the point of what I'm saying is that the Soviet Union victory has become sort of just a way to drum up patriotism in a way that is unique in the world because, well, maybe not like North Korea, but unique in the world because of such a unique history and the fact that they've come out of that and there's still a kind of nostalgia for the period is something that's interesting and difficult to understand from the Western perspective, I think. But
well, I think you said the right words. Difficult to understand from the Western perspective, but from their perspective, they may well understand it.
yes, of course I do. Yes.
Is there any doubt that the Russians were responsible for shooting down the Dutch airplane that came out of flight?
I don't know. I guess it would depend on who you asked.
Well,
as many
but
things.
no, but it would no. That's rather not so. I mean, there are people who evaluate these things responsibly, and there are people who don't evaluate them responsibly.
Yes. Well, I'm not an expert on the subject, so I can't speak to it.
Well, it's an event that ought to be noted for some idea of the way the Russian government works now.
Hmm.
Yeah, thank you so much for an interesting presentation. By the way, President Kennedy in June 1962 acknowledged the Russian sacrifice at a graduation speech at the American University. My question relates to well before the Allied opened a second front on the coast of France, they provided on a continuing basis. They sent convoys after convoys of cargo ships escorted by cruisers through the North Atlantic, facing the stormy Atlantic and the German U-boats, to supply the Russians. And boats went all the way to Murmansk, and providing heavy equipment, tanks and jeeps and ammunition and everything. That was in the early years the lifeline of the Russian military. Did Stalin ever acknowledge that contribution?
I'm sure he did because most of the speeches that I read were. I had a book of Stalin's like wartime speeches, which were just given on the anniversary of various important dates in the Soviet calendar. He does spend a lot of time acknowledging, like a fair amount of time acknowledging the Allied contributions. That incident specifically, I can't speak to, but he does.
Did you come across it? How did Stalin try to explain away the 1939 Nazi-Soviet pact, where between he and the Nazis they both invaded Poland and agreed to split it? So he was an ally with the Nazis well before he was ever on the side of the West, and refused to believe that the Nazis would even invade Poland. would invade Russia. So how did he explain that?
Really, I think Stalin's main interest was in asserting that, of course, you have to break a few eggs to make an omelet. I mean, that was pretty much his entire rationale for anything suspicious he did, as well as the fact that Soviet state media was in control of so much that it was easy to obfuscate and dodge topics like that.
I know from personal experience how the World War II was kept alive in the memories of generations, and I'm still to this point refused to ride my husband's motorcycle sidecar because it reminds me of the Nazis, and I'm not that old. But I'm curious, in your personal experience when you were in Russia, did you encounter how the memories kept alive now? Is it in schools, is it like what the organizations you mentioned, Nashi, or is it penetrating on other levels? That's question one. And number two, have you encountered any mention of Lend-Lease programs provided by the United States during World War II, or is this kind of like the unwanted history that is being cast out right now?
As for the second question, yes. I found almost no mention of Lend-Lease or anything like that in any of Putin's recent speeches on the Great Patriotic War as a whole, especially in his Victory Day speeches, as well as various statements like on the topic. I think that they were possibly more prevalent a little earlier on in the early Putin years, although I can't speak to exactly. There was, of course, a time when, in the early Putin years, when our relationship softened a bit before it turned around 2005. So I imagine then it was a little softer. But as for the personal experience, yes, I noticed significant importance of the Great Patriotic War and its memories in Russia among even young children, as well as older people who actually had maybe parents who served in the war. I saw, as I mentioned, I had a bunch of like bumper stickers up there. Those are everywhere. One very popular one is it says "Спасибо, деду, за победу," which means thanks, Grandpa, for the victory. It's in a little rhyme. Those are very frequently I've seen. I was there for Russia Day, and that's not like a super popular holiday, but they do have a day off. So there's like some, not parades, but like festivities commemorating, well, that holiday commemorates the new Russian constitution, which is why it sort of hasn't caught on yet to be like a really exciting holiday. But even there were a lot of children, like there was a children's performance group singing like old patriotic war songs, that kind of thing. I mean, it's taught in schools. And every child, even today, knows a lot about the history. Yep.
But I was just thinking, I have a slight problem in parsing your talk, because on the one hand, you can talk about various groups in Russia, since you mentioned that youth group, or other groups. And then there's the figure of Putin. And of course, it's all happening in Russia, but the issue is, can you draw from some group conclusions about Putin or vice versa? So I'm trying to focus on the Putin issue just for the moment. There's certainly another interpretation of this whole series of events, which is probably different in the drift than you have, which is, as I mentioned when we talked earlier, according to the CIA, the main influence on Putin is an unknown guy named Ivan Ilyich, who they studied up on, and you can actually find him in Wikipedia somewhere, who was fought with the White Russians against the Reds in that 3 or 4 year war. that Trotsky eventually prevailed in. And then he left Russia, was in Germany, and actually became a Hegelian while he was in Germany, got heavily into German romantic classical philosophy. But, so there are a lot of writings by this person. So the point is, the belief is that Putin is in the tradition of this white Russian thinker, and he wrote a lot of stuff, and actually heavily influenced by certain Hegelian concepts of world history. So that puts him on the complete opposite side from Stalin in terms of his mental orientation. And then you have all sorts of things, you know, that you can, I'll make this brief, but, you know, for example, the 100th anniversary of the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution. They didn't celebrate it. And Putin said, well, it's too controversial, there are too many different opinions on it. But I mean, this is immense that they didn't celebrate that. And this recent interview that he gave to the reporters of Le Figaro on his visit in France, and they asked him about Peter the Great, and you could just hear in his answer to that he's seen himself as a figure in Russian history that is similar to Peter the Great, not to Stalin, and so forth and so on. So I'm saying there's this total, I mean, if we're just focusing on Putin and not on, you know, various things going on in Russia, I think there's quite a different take on Putin that at least the CIA is picking up on.
Yeah, as I mentioned, my intention is not to compare Putin and Stalin as people or as their philosophies, because they're obviously completely different, minus there's sort of course, authoritarian tendencies, but the political ideologies are extremely, extremely different. Really, what I was just trying to do was compare the rhetoric used between the two in their speeches, and how it's very similar, and how Putin is using that kind of language. Not necessarily, he doesn't quote like communism is great sort of speeches, but like just the kind of rhetoric was the main point I was trying to make. As for the groups in Russia versus the figure of Putin himself, the reason I mentioned Nashi and Unarmia was just to show that the young people are learning in the same ways about the history as their parents did, minus some of the communist apologism, and that most of these groups are for instance, Unarmia is sponsored largely by the Russian Ministry of Defense, so obviously it's going to be a pro-Putin line. Nashi was also heavily influenced by the Kremlin as well, so they have their roots and their support in government, which I think gives some insight into what Putin himself, what his priorities are, and his interests.
Just like mentioned, I came across a really interesting 1-hour documentary on a group of French pilots, several hundred apparently, who joined with the Soviet forces and flew actually Soviet aircraft. They're known as Normandy Niemen, and apparently they were extremely valued by the Soviets. They have quite a monument to the, I think, 45 or so who died in the course of shooting down several hundred Nazi and German aircraft and defending convoys, defending actually flying cover for the Soviet bombers as well.
Yeah, I'd like to see how they're honored today, if at all.
Oh, they had quite a monument built in. I think it's in Moscow, or maybe closer to where they actually were based. It's actually on Amazon Prime. I have it right now.
All right, great. I'll write that one down.
Normandy Niemen. Niemen, I think, signifies a particular battle that they were so essential in winning.
Sorry.
No, that's fine.
Again, from your personal experience, can you describe how you received that you are an American in Russia? How were people towards you? Did you encounter any hostilities, unfriendliness, or was it more welcoming? How was the overall? How were you rated?
I lived with a family, Russian family, so I was treated very hospitably. I didn't really encounter any antagonism except in the bus station when I was trying to buy bus tickets. But I'm not sure if that was just the excellent customer service or the fact that I was an American. You have to show them your passport so they can register you for traveling. But when they saw I was an American, they got a little angrier at me. But other than that, the Russian people have showed me great hospitality, and were very curious about how Americans really live. Have a lot of conceptions about how American life is based on like American movies, for instance. I got a lot of questions about American high schools, and are they really? Does everyone always have big drunken parties on the weekends, like in the movies? And I was like, no, but I was happy. But I was happy to tell them about what they wanted to hear and about. It was fun.
So, what's the closest parallel you can draw among Western leaders with this propagandization of nostalgia? Is there anything that is comparable to Putin and Stalin in the Western world?
Ooh, that's actually a really good question. I have to think about that.
And if there isn't, why not?
Well, I can tell you why there isn't in Germany, because they successfully denazified after the war for obvious reasons. But to me it's a major contributing factor that after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, there was no real process of decommunization. In terms of like symbols, buildings, that sort of thing, not in terms of like political. That was a very complicated process, and it was such a dramatic change from one system to another that there wasn't really motivation or time to purge the country of any communist symbolism or that sort of thing. And I think that is a real sticking point.
So I would challenge that just a little bit.
Go
Now,
ahead.
I mean, because everybody's seen GoldenEye, right? Isn't that the one where they're fighting in the graveyard with the busts of Stalin and Lenin and these great statues? And again, from some anecdotes from people who have had personal experience, I know that during some of the early periods of the 90s and through the mid and late 90s, there was moves to, destroy some of that legacy.
No, you're definitely right. That there was early on, particularly the very, very early days, and especially outside of Russia itself, but in the former Soviet republics, where they were, for instance, the occupied territories were very, very eager to get rid of the symbols of their oppressors. So that's why things progressed so quickly there. But it was a little more difficult, I think, for the Russian people to transition mentally out of that system. And just going to Russia today and seeing the hammers and sickles everywhere is just strange. It's almost like being in a time warp almost.
Would you compare it to, say, removing Confederate flags and Confederate statues from the South?
That is an interesting topic that I am not going to delve too deeply into, but it's interesting because you know what? Maybe that does contribute to some of this old "the South will rise again" stuff coming back up every once in a while. And who knows if that stuff were removed? Not saying that I would personally remove it. I actually don't really have an opinion on that subject, at least not here publicly. But I don't know. Who knows if it would help or if it would be outrageous. Obviously, there's a lot of strong feelings about it already, and things haven't even really strongly gotten underway. It does have a really legacy of badness. Yes?
Yeah, Rachel, I thought Rachel a little bit Russian language and Russian teacher here. What's your opinion about the mortal regiment? I'm from the family
Ha!
where the people died and fought against Nazis. And here in Washington, D.C., 2 years, we've had the mortal regiment, Russian speaking. Residents from different, by the way, former Soviet republics. And Спасибо, Деда за Победу, it's a mortal regiment. It's from the same, I don't know, like March and so on. What do you think, like, new generation of Americans, and what's your attitude?
I mentioned a little bit, I think, before you came in, the Mortar Regiment. I think obviously it's really important to remember the sacrifices of people, and that's why we do it here in DC with all the monuments and elsewhere. But mostly I talked about how the Immortal Regiment is a way for Russians to stay connected to Russia as a whole in their own expat communities. So, I don't know. I don't really see anything wrong with parades or anything. I just pointed out basically that it's a way for Russians to maintain ties to Russia.
Nancy, thanks for your presentation. I just wonder, could you tell me why Soviet Russia and America and the West, what's the difference? What the strengths that they have if you compare them all? Why they can be allies in a war and like become the enemy in a peacetime? And today what's going on? They have an embassy, they have a communication, but now instead of communication, they say all the spying. And then what's going on, what's the event, and they trigger all this narrative at this time.
Yeah, that's something I ask myself every day. It's just so bizarre to see like the picture of the Soviet soldiers and the American soldiers like shaking hands and hugging each other over the Elbe and that sort of thing, and to see how much things have changed. I think a lot of that was stemmed from the results of the Second World War and what different partners expected to receive from the spoils of war. And basically, I don't know, if necessity was what brought us together, I mean, our relationship was not outstanding before, but it was not quite as antagonistic. But I think it eventually became more about ideological differences than anything else. The complete disparity between communism and our system and the threat of that. And then I think honestly now it's become such a habit almost of reflexive antagonism on both sides that it's different. Sorry?
What about the fact that right after the end of the Second World War, the Soviet Union took over all those countries in Eastern Europe? That was what started the so-called Cold War. Do you know Churchill's Iron Curtain speech at Fulton, Missouri?
Indeed I do.
And that was the problem.
Yes, that was part of the problem.
That they were taking over other people's countries and oppressing those people in those other countries.
Yes.
And they had larger designs than that were not necessarily realized.
Can you confirm whether, I think it's Mussolini said that fascism was really corporatism, the alignment of the largest corporate interests with the state, and what the Russian perspective would be today, where, you know, as my understanding is, the Russian central bank is not submissive to the whole Western system of central banking, which maybe is a sore point for the West. And at the same time, in the West, you know, we now let corporations give unlimited amounts to political campaigns. Corporatism is sort of running the show here now. So might that be a reason for them feeling a bit of deja vu?
Possibly, although I'm not sure. Well, they do make a lot of connections between liberalism and fascism, as I talked about. Interesting, and I personally don't really understand it. I have to do some more research on how those two things are connected when they're speaking about them. But
I remember hearing that quote that Mussolini specifically said, well, fascism is really just corporatism, the alignment of the corporate interests with the state, and that would be interesting to validate that, I suppose.
yeah, that's interesting thought. Okay, I'm gonna do like one more probably since it's getting pretty late.
How confident are you of your sources when you check all these, do your research on all these Russian sources and writing? Because Russians have a tendency to embellish and add whatever it is they want to add. How confident are you that this is true or a lot of it is fabricated?
Well, I have an entire bibliography, and this entire presentation has footnotes for every quotation, every factual thing I wrote. Basically, my sources ranged from scholarly articles in Western and non-Western scholarly publications, like peer-reviewed articles, which are checked factually, and I visited, a lot of them are like direct quotations from speeches, and I can read Russian, so I usually read the English and then check with the Russian to make sure the translation is like alright. And usually it checks out, but obviously there are some words that don't translate quite with exactly the same connotations that you have to be careful with. And the sources that I got from Russian news sources like RT or Sputnik, obviously you always have to read them with a grain of salt. But as long as you acknowledge that any kind of source you might use might have a sort of bias in one way or another, it's not too bad. Just power through it and recognize that when you're collecting sources.
Do you compare with Russian archives of the Eastern Bloc, countries of the Eastern Bloc, as opposed to the Russian archive?
In this case, yes, I looked into some like Latvian stuff, but it was translated. But I'm just a grad student and I don't really have access to like awesome sources in original form, so.
Do the Russians still remember the Napoleonic invasion of 1812?
Yes, but
A beautiful book, War and Peace by Tolstoy. I think it's must reading with Pierre Bezukhov from Rainier and so on.
yes.
Do you still remember that?
Yes, well, that sort of literature is compulsory reading in schools, so it's kind of hard to forget about it, like War and Peace and etc. All right, one more, I promise one more, and then we're done. Yeah,
So sorry to get one last in.
oh, that's okay.
So how do you think the new laws about VPN will affect this trend of propaganda in Russia going forward?
This is interesting. Yeah, I recently heard about this as well. I can't imagine that too much will change because I think people will find ways around it as they do. If they really have a desire to, but at the same time, most Russians get their news from television and not the internet. With the exception of younger people who may have the motivation to actually seek out other sources. With the exception of younger people, I don't think that it will be a huge shift in anything. It's just right. Well, thank you everyone for coming out.